Right, comrades. So this is a bit of a theoretical meeting. What I'm going to try and do is, throw some what I think are important basic principles of how we should try and analyze Islamist movements, and then hopefully, in the discussion we'll get to the more concrete examples. I will use examples, but this will mainly be a general talk about the methods that I think we should try and adopt when looking at Islamism. Now, there's so much confusion about around the subject of what exactly is Islamism. I came from France this morning, and last week a group of women decided to swim in a pool wearing a burkini, and the media and the rulers and Macron told us that this is an example of Islamism. This is nonsense, of course. But more seriously, you might automatically associate the term Islamism with terrorism, maybe non-violent but nevertheless bearded and foreign men shouting about the West for one reason or another. It can be seen as a purely, in the 21st century at least, as a purely irrational phenomenon that shows that Islam is inherently backward, that it can be the polar opposite in Samuel Huntington's famous Clash of Civilizations between an enlightened, liberal West and an Islamic East. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time kind of debunking this theory, which is very obviously racist and Islamophobic. So I think this is a space where we all agree that Islamophobia and racism are bad things. So we're not going to spend a lot of time arguing with this. But if we look at the reality on the ground, particularly in the Middle East, a bit more seriously, you'll find that what we might call, for lack of a better wording, political Islam. So this means political forces which ideologically relate to Islam in one way or another. I'm not talking about veiled women. I'm not talking about maybe the social conservative practices, the more or less social conservative practices that are associated with Islamic faith. I'm really talking about people who declare themselves politically as adherents of in one way or another applying the teachings of Islam in politics, in matters of state, in matters of relationships between social entities. So this is Islamism. So it is basically political Islam, for lack of a better expression. So it goes from the ruling class of Iran, elitist terrorist organizations like ISIS, the militias that were fighting ISIS in Iraq, they're also Islamist. That's what they say about themselves anyway. Mass electoral movements like the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, armed resistance movements like the Palestinian movement Hamas in Gaza, and so on and so forth. So the list, if we were to do a list of the Islamist political forces, it would be virtually an endless list. And they're not just there in the background, obviously. They're playing a very important role in politics in the Middle East and beyond. If we only look at the past decade or so in the Middle East, that has been shaped and reshaped by waves of revolutions and counter-revolutions, the Islamists have always played a very important role. So, for instance, in Egypt, obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood entered the arena as a mass electoral force, won the election, and then was overthrown in a military coup. In Syria, in the course of the Syrian revolution, we might associate Islamists a lot more with the armed struggle. After the revolution turned into an armed struggle, this is when the Islamists really came to the fore. If we fast forward to today, in Sudan and Algeria, the situation is yet different. In Sudan, the Islamists are actually associated with the ruling class because the dictator Omar al-Bashir, well, the ex-dictator Omar al-Bashir, thankfully, came to power in a coup in 1989 where military officers associated with the Muslim Brotherhood played a very important role. In Algeria, it's at another situation. The Islamists in Algeria do not appear to be on the front stage today, but Islamism casts a long shadow over Algerian politics because the generation that is doing the uprising today, effectively, grew up in the 1990s during what is called in Algeria the Dark Decade, which was basically a period of civil war that was sparked by, again, a military coup against an elected Islamist government in Algeria. So, you know, it does pose a theoretical challenge how to analyze Islamism. Either we go the Huntington way, which is the easiest way, which is they're all an embodiment of backwardness, all Muslims are backward, etc. 1 + 1 = 2, and we collapse into this form of racism. Or we can just say, well, they're all so different. They're just a bunch of very special cases. Every single organization, every single country is a special case, and therefore, you know, Islamism is not even a thing. Now, I want to argue that we can probably find a scientific way of looking at Islamism. So I obviously cannot exhaust the subject completely, but I want to, the time that I have left, talk about three main themes which I think are quite important. The first one is, even if Islamists in general, in their political intervention, are usually reactionary in terms of individual freedoms, women's rights, LGBT rights, and so on and so forth. Islamism is not a backwards politics. It's not a survival of the past. It is a politics of modernity. So, second, although the discourse of Islamism might evoke the Quran, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood usually says, you know, the Quran is our constitution, or Islam is the solution, and so on and so forth. So generally very abstract principles that were first enunciated in an Islamic language anyway in the 7th century, so quite a long time ago. To apply those principles, the Islamists are burdened with modern means. They have no choice because, you know, they live in the 20th and the 21st century. So we have to understand this difference between the appearance of the ideology which evokes a timeless, eternal set of values, and the fact that actually they need to, you know, use politics of today, the very profane politics of today. So they are part of modernity, whether they like it or not, and whether we like it or not, more importantly. Finally, you know, depending on time, I want to look at probably two of the most extreme examples of Islamist politics, which are the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and ISIS. This is going to be very quickly, and then I'm going to try to think about some strategic implications for the left. It's mainly going to be about the Middle East, but there are quite a lot of meetings at Marxism which deal with, you know, religion theoretically. Sue did this earlier today, and there are quite a lot of meetings about Islamophobia in Europe. So I'm mainly going to talk about the Middle East, but hopefully, you know, this will be useful for you. So the first thing to say is that in spite of the appearances, Islamism has not always existed. It hasn't. Actually, it started in the 19th century, and in the late 19th century at that. It emerges in the context of, you know, what we might call the Islamic world, being very clearly overtaken by the previously backwards West, first through superior economic achievements, superior intellectual achievements, technological achievements, and then through direct imperial conquest, turning much of the Islamic world into colonies. And our comrade from Turkey, Ron Margulies, argued in an article he wrote a couple of years ago, I think, which was really well titled. It's called Looking Back to the Past to Imagine the Future. So he argues that like secular Arab, Turkish, and Iranian nationalists, so basically what we usually call the progressive nationalists, Islamism is obsessed with the following question. How did we fall behind? Why are we still behind the West? And what can we do to catch up? So those are extremely vague notions that are shared between the Islamists, the nationalists, the liberals, and even some of the Marxists in the Middle East. So you wouldn't be surprised that actually Islamism, as it evolved as a political current in the 20th and 21st century, has done so always in interaction, in rivalry, in exchange, sometimes in very bloody exchange, with the nationalist currents, the various liberal currents, and the various left-wing currents. Islamism does not exist in abstraction. It exists very much in the politics of the Middle East in the 20th and 21st century. So I want to go back for a few minutes to a scholar called Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who is often considered as being the ideological founder of Islamism, or at least one of its most important proponents. So he's from the 19th century. He's from Iran, actually, although his name is al-Afghani, which means the Afghan. That's because probably he wanted people to believe that he was a Sunni so that they would listen to him a bit more. He sought to answer the question that I mentioned earlier, which is why are we so, how and why have we been overtaken? And in a nutshell, his answer was, actually the problem comes from the fact that Muslims and the Islamic world has abandoned the original rationalist teachings of Islam and has, sunk into superstition. So he's already looking to the past because he's saying, I think, it's a wrong argument, but it's what he believed nevertheless, that the problem is because Islam has changed. Islam used to be rationalistic. It used to be scientifically superior to Christianity, and this has changed. So what Muslims need to do is that they need to look to the West, borrow the scientific achievements, the technological achievements, the economic achievements, and even some of the political institutions of the West, but rejecting the cultural ethics of the West and keeping the Islamic, the proper Islamic ethics. So it's a mishmash of, as if you go to a supermarket and you choose, I want this economy, this technology, this scientific method, and then I'll take those values, and we'll just get a society out of this. Now, it might seem illusionary today, but this was actually a very, very powerful current of thought at the time, because people were genuinely asking, why did we fall behind? And not many people had an answer. So he had an answer. But the problem, one of the problems was that he was preaching in the wilderness. Like many enlightened individuals in backward societies, Afghani did not see ordinary people, the mass of people, the people who are called the Amma in the Islamic tradition, as being the agents of change. He tried his whole life, he was a propagandist basically his whole life, he tried to enlighten Muslim rulers who were extremely far from, it was just not possible to enlighten them because they ruled over this kind of society for a reason. So in this way, he was actually quite close to the European Enlightenment philosophers who did not want to educate the masses but spend their time educating the royal courts in Europe. Vainly, unfortunately. So the thing is, the principles of Afghani could only come into political application when what we might call the prime materials for this started to exist, which is modern social classes shaped by capitalism, or at least the interaction between capitalism and the societies, the Islamic societies as they existed. Islamism as actually an effective politics starts in the 20th century and obviously the 21st century. It does not start with Afghani. He died a broken man. Actually, he expressed a lot of regret of not having turned to the masses because he realized that talking to the despots was quite futile. Now, this is where it comes from ideologically and historically. Now, what all the Islamists have in common, whether from ISIS to the Muslim Brotherhood and everyone in between, is that they preach a return to the original teachings of Islam in one way or another. It can be the Quran, it can be the the so-called four righteous caliphs. This is what the Iranian Khomeini used to talk about all the time. Islam was okay until the fourth caliph, who was Ali, and then it all went to hell. Or they might go back to the so-called golden age of Islam, the Abbasid period, etc. Either way, they go back to a period which is over 1,000 years older than it's more than 1,000 years a year ago. And that's when the enlightened progressives say, this is why this is a backwards movement. It's because it wants to take us back to the 7th century or the 8th century or the 9th century, a very old century anyway. This kind of argument, which is the cornerstone of the Islamic fundamentalism thesis, which basically says that, again, from ISIS to the Muslim Brotherhood, they're all Islamic fundamentalists, and the differences are in the details. The way that they want to get to an Islamic society for ISIS is it's an elitist armed organization and mass murder and kidnappings and enslavings, etc. And for the Muslim Brotherhood, it's a more or less democratic way to power. But those are only details. And what matters is that they are Islamic fundamentalists. This is an extremely flawed argument. I think the first reason is, you see, in the Quran, there is actually no positive description of what a political system should look like. If you read the Quran, it's basically what you can get from it today in the 21st century is a set of very abstract values. Values that you will find in pretty much every other religion. So the question of applying the Quran politically is by definition, whether we like it or not, open to interpretation. This was the case very, very soon, actually, after the death of Muhammad. I mean, even at the time, there was no, you could not read the Quran and say, okay, this is how we should organize society. So how do you think things will be in the 20th and 21st century? So it's always open to interpretation. So it's not fixed. And even actually as some people, or even the Islamists themselves, the Islamist leaders anyway, might like to imagine themselves, sitting in a minaret far above, giving lectures about eternal sacred values to an obedient and grateful population. The problem is that very concretely, they have to use very profane methods of politics. They have to use social classes that exist today in the 20th and 21st century. They have to relate in one way or another to other political formations that can be their rival or their enemy, their competitors, their collaborator from time to time. And those are, again, modern political formations. They need, obviously, to relate to the state, which is a modern state that exists in the 20th and 21st century reality. So even if, and most of them actually do not imagine this, but even if some of the Islamists imagine that they really want to go back to the 7th century, well, you have two choices. Either you engage in politics and, forget about the 7th century, or you sit in the mosque and you don't do politics and you're not an Islamist anymore. You're just a Salafist and you adopt a very personal lifestyle which you think gets you closer to what Islam originally was. But if you're doing politics, you're doing it in the 20th and 21st century. This is extremely important to realize. Second, the idea that ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood, again, I'm taking the two extremes, are more or less the same and they differ in the details, is like saying that a small band of guerrilla fighters in the Cuban jungle, the Bolshevik Party in 1917, or a group of mass murderers in Cambodia calling themselves the Khmer Rouge, are basically the same because they relate to the Communist Manifesto in one way or another. Obviously, this is not the case, and any concrete study of the history of those different movements will conclude that they are extremely different and politically cannot be considered the same, even if the very abstract ideology, which is heading towards a communist society, is professed. So, does all of this mean that ideology does not matter? That it's just an appearance, an illusion, and that we should look through it to the reality? Actually, it does matter. It does matter because Islamists, like all other people who engage in politics, are engaged in this very, very simple, human interaction, which is the thing that makes us human, is that we're faced with an objective world which we do not really control, but we're acting back on it and trying to change it. And we're acting back on it, whether we like it or not, using an ideology. We're using a set of ideas that we think are the correct ideas, that we think, for one reason or another, should be the ideas that end up widespread in society. And we think that those ideas are our guide. So if we actually care, and as revolutionary socialists, we do care very, very much about the mass of people who can be attracted to Islamism, we need to look at ideology. But we need to look at it in a concrete way. We cannot say ideology says this in the books, and therefore, this is what the Islamists will always do. This is what they will always be like. Their ideology talks about the Quran. Islamism is a backward politics. They have nothing to do in modernity. No, actually, for the vast majority of the Islamists, what their religious ideology means is that they believe that in one way or another, that it is possible to arrive to a conciliation of the conflicts that are tearing society apart. Because Islamism is, at the end of the day, an attempt, for better or worse, like nationalism, like liberalism, like anti-colonialism, it's an attempt to come to terms politically, economically, and also culturally with the traumatism of capitalist development in the region. And I'm talking about the traumatism because it did not happen gradually, very, very slowly, the slow, uninterrupted march of progress. No, it happened through, colonialism, imperialism, dictatorships, and so on and so forth, exploitation, and things like that. So people are faced with a society that is in conflict, that is torn apart, like all class societies, and they're trying to get an ideology under which they believe that we can have a conciliation between all social classes. And actually, the best ideologies, the best type of ideologies that can give you that can give you a sense of conciliation is religious ideologies, because religious ideologies say, basically, we have a set of eternal values that are floating above society. We're rich and poor, but we're all Muslims at the end of the day. The poor will patiently wait for heaven, for the eternal, for the otherworldly reward, and the rich will, stay rich, but they will be nice, and there will be charity, and so on and so forth. So this is not, of course, peculiar to Islamism. I mean, I'm going to be a bit provocative, but in France, the Yellow Vest movement, it's actually a very radical movement, but the ideology is conciliatory. It's saying, no, we should go back to the real France where, there was a good welfare state and so on and so forth. So, okay, thank you. So in this way, I think, the nationalism of the Yellow Vest is also, in a way, a religious ideology, because France becomes something completely abstract over history, over social classes, and it's just a set of eternal republican values. And republicanism can also start to look like a religious ideology. When you look at Jean-Luc Mélenchon in Parliament talking about the Republic, he reminds me of, Shiite clerics talking about the martyrdom of Hussein. He gets into a state of trance because, the Republic is so important. This actually happens everywhere. We live today in a society that is full of maybe secular, but nevertheless religious images. When people say, British values are above politics. When Grenfell happened, they said, oh, this is a tragedy. We're all, as British people, very, very sad about this. Let's not play politics with this, while actually Grenfell was an extreme embodiment of politics and of the consequences of politics. So if we forget about the religious books for a moment, actually a religious ideology is present everywhere. Okay. And obviously, the classes that form the bulk of the Islamist movement, it's not the very poor, although the very poor are very often drawn to the Islamists, and it's not the very rich. It's actually the people in between. It's the middle classes. It's the classes that, because of their position, and this is something that Marx talks about in the 18th of Brumaire, he says they are naturally, when they engage in society, they are naturally drawn not towards their own self-interest, because they're, in between the rich and the poor, but they're drawn towards ideologies that allow them to imagine a society where there is no more class conflict. While, for instance, communist ideology or revolutionary socialist ideology, of course, we want to get to a society where there is no more class conflict, but the means to get there is actually to increase class conflict, and to make our camp, our side, aware that class conflict is actually a thing, and that the rich are always engaging in class conflict. No, the people in the middle say, we don't want this kind of conflict, which is why they're very often drawn to not only Islamism, but also nationalism, particularly in the third world. Okay, so what all this means, the idea that we have very abstract values that we want to apply in society today, abstract values over which no one will disagree. Justice, that's a very good abstract value. No one will say, well, I'm in favor of injustice. I'm trying to make a point here. Everyone likes justice, nominally at least. Everyone likes solidarity. Everyone likes, altruism, and so on and so forth. And those are very obviously values that are professed by religion. The thing is that whenever you get to politics, actually justice doesn't mean the same thing for poor people and for rich people. Don't need to tell you. Even if they pray in the same mosque, even if they listen to the same sermon by the same imam, the words of justice, those values that you will find in the Quran, are not the same. To take an extreme example, ISIS and a Shiite cleric in Saudi Arabia use the exact same verse. On the one hand, ISIS, which is basically kill everyone, and the other, he was actually using the example of black liberation struggle in America to say, if black people can do it in America, so we can do it here as an oppressed minority. So they were using actually the same verse. In one way, it was apocalyptic terrorism for ISIS. In the other, it was actually a very progressive attempt at mobilizing people against the Saudi regime. So basically, when it gets to politics, the abstract values on which all the Islamists agree become, very different. This is when social classes come to the fore. So if you imagine mass, here I'm talking basically about mass Islamist movement. If you imagine mass Islamist movements as a building, whenever nothing's happening in society, whenever most people are isolated, they've fallen in political apathy, which is unfortunately 99% of the time, the organization is fine. But when there's an earthquake, when there's a revolution, when there are social tensions, the building will start to break along certain lines. This is definitely what happened with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and I'm taking the example of the Muslim Brotherhood, but this is what happens in general. And so, to get to the before I get to the strategic questions, I want to talk about ISIS for a second. You see, ISIS is a completely different kind of organization. I don't need to remind you of the context of an incredible amount of social, economic destruction in Syria and Iraq. We're not talking just about economic destruction. We're talking about such an intense destruction of the country. Iraq, it happened over 20, 30 years. In Syria, it happened much quickly. But a total collapse, actually, of social relations between people. It's the kind of context that encourages people to get completely apocalyptic, end of world kind of ideologies. But at the same time, unlike the Muslim Brotherhood and actually even Hamas and Hezbollah and so on and so forth, ISIS does not and has never attempted at mobilizing people politically. They literally never have. What they do is they say that we're going to do things and you're going to be ruled and shut up. So ISIS is an extremely elitist organization, and therefore they do not have a mass base. So you cannot really, obviously engage politically with ISIS because it's almost as if they didn't do politics. The Muslim Brotherhood is obviously very, very, very different. So to to get to the end of my talk and propose, in the light of what is happening in Algeria and Sudan and what has happened in the past decade and hopefully, the uprisings that are coming, we need to look at the strategic question, and we need to put the Islamists in this context. They're not a special case. They don't exist apart from those societies. They're in it, and you see, if we have a vision for the Middle East of what we call a stagist Stalinist vision, which says basically, before you have any kind of socialist revolution or a social revolution, we need what is sometimes called a democratic national revolution, which means that we need to establish, in a nutshell, liberal democracies. And this is a phase in time over which we cannot skip. So this means negating completely actually what happened in Russia in 1917 and the theory of permanent revolution. If we think that we need a whole historic phase where we have a liberal democracy, where we have the separation of church and state, and so on and so forth, then as the left, your duty becomes to fight the Islamists as much as you're fighting the state, because the Islamists cannot actually exist in, or are at least irrelevant in, a society where you have a very clear separation between church and state, where you have individual freedoms and so on and so forth. However, if we understand that actually the type of state, the type of social structure, the type of class structure that exists in the Middle East today is capitalist, it is modern, this is the capitalism that we're going to get, we're not going to get any other capitalism, then the situation becomes very different. Then the Muslim Brotherhood and all the other Islamists actually, from being an anomaly, a pre-modern anomaly that you should get rid of, they become one more symptom of the contradictions of capitalism as it developed in the Middle East. And therefore, you start seeing them in another light. In the stagist view of history, history works, it's basically a rail track. And you have two locomotives. The locomotive of progress, which obviously we are driving, the progressive forces in general are driving, and the locomotive of backwardness, of counter-revolution, and so on and so forth, over which there is a fight between the Islamists and the old state. They're fighting over who's going to drive the locomotive of backwardness. But in reality, since we're using very bad metaphors, in reality, in reality, I think modern society should be seen not as a rail track, but as a solar system that gravitates around the state. The state matters. The state matters above everything else. For any kind of socialist revolutionary strategy, we should see the overthrow of the state as the ultimate goal. And we should understand that actually in the process of revolution, in the process of people actually intervening for themselves on the arena of history, and this is the only way revolution is going to happen, by the way. It's the only way it's going to be victorious. In the process of revolution, all the abstract ideologies are, anyone who agrees with an abstract ideology is going to ask, well, what does it mean concretely? What does it mean right now on the ground? And this is where the Islamists will find a lot of problems. This is when their building will start to vacillate, because abstract values will no longer be enough to hold their organizations together. Okay, thanks. Yeah, basically done. So to sum up, if you want to hear about the strategic questions that are posed by the revolutions in Sudan and Algeria, there are a couple of meetings during the rest of Marxism that will do it very, very well. But really, I want to go back to, based on what I said, I want to go back to really Chris Harman's conclusion to his 1994, I think. I mean, it's outdated because it's 1994, but it's still an extremely important article that you should read. And it has a great title, which is The Prophet and the Proletariat. Chris Harman's conclusion was, whenever the Islamists are in opposition, and this is very important, whenever they are in opposition, we should be with the Islamists sometimes and with the state never. because you cannot actually be neutral whenever the state is involved. You cannot say this doesn't concern us. You cannot say in France, the problem between the veiled women in the French state is not my problem. I don't like the veil, I don't like the state, so therefore neither veil nor the state. This is completely catastrophic. Saying neither the Islamists who are today, who tens of thousands of them are filling the prisons in Egypt, is a catastrophic position, because actually repression will start with the Islamists under the pretense of secularism, under the pretense of defending the state, and so on and so forth. It will start with the Islamists, and then it will spread to the rest. This is what has been happening in Egypt for the past 6 years, and this is something that we should be extremely aware of. We can be with the Islamists sometimes, first because we need victories, and there are lots of them, and there are many Islamists, and we need victories, and to get victories we need mass movements. We need victories to build our organizations and to build hope in the Middle East, but also because people who are attracted to the Islamists really should be socialists. Many of them really should be socialists. This doesn't mean wavering on any of our principles in terms of gender equality, in terms of LGBT equality, but it does mean never adopting a neutral position when even a reactionary but a mass electoral movement is repressed by the state. We must never be neutral. Thank you. I'll just end it here.